You're on the air. Don't say anything crazy. Hello everybody and welcome back to another edition of Brobears Talk. It has been a little bit of a while. Brother Bear, welcome.
Thank you very much, Brother Bear. I'm very excited for this one, as I am. I say that for all podcasts, and it is truly honest. We obviously covered Bitcoin last time. I'm sure there will be a good dash of Bitcoin in this one. Either way, I'll find a way to put it in.
To weasel it in there somehow.
Exactly. Trust me to talk about Bitcoin. I need one of those mugs who's like at risk of speaking at Bitcoin at length.
In Bitcoin we trust. And tell me, Brother Bear, actually, as we've already kicked this off talking about Bitcoin, tell me the quote that you sent to some family members regarding Bitcoin. I want you to recite it to me again.
Indeed. Well, it is allegedly a quote by the great Satoshi Nakamoto, of course, and the anonymous creator of Bitcoin, whom we covered at length on our last podcast. But essentially, the saying goes, not word for word, because you put me on the spot, you bastard. But I'll give it a go.
Give it a punt.
It's something along the lines of, oh God, do you mind if I just look for it on Google and you preoccupy our listeners with something else for now?
Yeah, I'll twiddle my thumbs with the listeners, with the millions and billions of listeners.
Do the proverbial twiddle.
Okay, while Andre's doing that, I'll actually introduce kind of the area I would like us to cover on this podcast, and it's actually going to relate to kind of the meaning of life and what makes people happy, what makes people tick, what's it all for. And this is one of the tritest topics that anybody could ever discuss, because it's one of those things that you're really not meant to think about, or your parents often tell you not to think about, the government tells you not to think about for too long. As a lot of our podcasts have covered issues of money and financial growth, spiritual growth, but we've never tackled this head on, have we, Brother Bear?
No, we haven't, and I think we should, almost like it is the right practice and the best practice to face waves head on as a ship should. Full speed ahead, not starboard or board, but straight on, and really tackle the question head on. I think there's so many answers to that question. There's the obvious one that the purpose and point of life is life itself. I mean, the very fact we're here is a miracle on so many levels. The very fact we exist, the very fact that atoms are glued together in the way they are, the fact that gravity is what it is and not a minutia, smaller or greater, means that planets are able to orbit stars as they do. It means that stars are able to form at all. So I think there's many beautiful mathematical miracles that underlie our existence, and I think we can almost spend a lifetime of looking at any one of these miracles in great detail on the minutiae. So I think there was a saying where one can spend a lifetime studying a blade of grass and still not be done by the end of it.
Yes, and that's I couldn't agree more with that. Really, you can look at a minute point down to the micron from so many angles and so many different contexts, and still not fully understand it.
Yes, so I think almost the silent answer as to the point of life is, well, there's just inherent beauty and simplicity in sort of both coalesce together that seem to create life as we know it. And I think simply experiencing life is maybe almost the answer, the inherent answer or the silent answer that the universe gives us.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, this comes back to the Alan Watts quote that we shared earlier in the week, that the meaning of life is just to be alive. It's so plain and obvious and simple, but everybody rushes around in a great panic, as if necessary to achieve something beyond themselves.
Right, and I think that's such a good point, right? We were also preoccupied with sort of almost human definitions of what success is and defining that for ourselves and finding what that is for ourselves, and then sacrificing a great deal of time and energy in achieving that. But I think actually 99% of the scope of life is to be found in simply the experience of living, and really the way you live it is so secondary to that, and it's not the sort of prime purpose at all. It's just experiencing life for what it is.
Yes, exactly. Just sort of an everyday kind of, I suppose, more dynamically experiencing life without second guessing constantly. The truth is, there is no definitive meaning of life. I think it was Naval Ravikant, who said that if we knew the meaning of life definitively, we would no longer be free. The meaning of life, it's trite in the sense that when you're a child, you're told, don't think about that, or here's God is the meaning of life, or, go get a job, or money is the meaning of life. Lots of people have different definitions, but if there was one definitive answer, we wouldn't be free. We'd all be trying to outcompete each other on trying to achieve that goal. But because we don't definitively know, you're just free to do whatever you want. The meaning of life is life itself, whatever you choose for it to be.
I think that's such a beautiful answer, right? Because what it allows you to do is, like you say, live out freedom in its true almost purpose, in that we get to define how our story reads. And again, looking at timescales, this occurred to me that obviously, the universe operates on timescales we can't even fathom. And our lifetimes, whether that's 80 or really lucky and when you live to 100, is just a minute blip on the radar that barely registers on the cosmic timescales. So I think it's almost like the universe implicitly laughing at you for even contemplating the idea, or worrying about the idea of what the meaning of my life is, and rather just thinking, you're nothing but a spark in the greater cosmos. You're very lucky to experience this, so just stop worrying and maybe just be.
Just be, and it's easier said than done, right? But I think everybody wants to leave a legacy, and everyone wants to be remembered, and I think for most humans that is the meaning of life. I wrote a book, or I made a film, or I created something that lived way beyond me, and that's, to many people, rightly so, the meaning of life. But then you have to look back, as you just noted, on the sort of more astronomical level. Do you know the names of any Mayans or any Tudors beyond maybe one or two? There's so many times in history, not that long ago, 300-400 years, and I don't know anybody from that era.
Right. Yeah.
So it's almost a pipe dream.
Yeah, and I think the most primitive instantiation of legacy is your offspring. That's biological legacy. And that's kind of the one urge we all have, is to have a biological legacy and have our DNA, our code, be passed on. So that's our. You're right. I think legacy sits at the very core of it in terms of biology, and then is expressed in other facets of life, namely through achievement, whether in some form or another. And someone like Satoshi Nakamoto will probably live on forevermore as the father of Bitcoin. And that brings me just to the quote, Brother Bear, which reads,
"If you don't believe..."
I will. If you don't believe it or don't get it, I don't have the time to try to convince you. Sorry.
I love that you put "sorry" in at the end there.
But it's part of the quote.
Yeah, it's part of the quote.
It's part of the quote. Which I love. He obviously had a sense of humor.
He had a sense of humor, and the beauty of that quote is that he's not a huckster, right? He's not trying to make you buy into a get-rich-quick scheme. He's, it's obviously not a pyramid scheme. It's obviously not. He's not going to be making money off anybody else. That's, he's talking more philosophically about the idea of Bitcoin. If you don't understand it or care for it, then he's not going to invest any time helping you.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
Exactly. and I think it always speaks to the fact it doesn't need your approval. It's going to happen regardless. So, don't participate. We don't really care. It will kind of govern all value going forward. But if you want to be part of that world, join us. If not, we don't. That's also great.
Also great. Yeah, also great. It's quite funny when people have that kind of apathetic finish to their ideas. Like, oh, if you don't want to join this, then great too.
Yeah, and maybe it's the ultimate, sort of expression and marker of success or belief in the success of your idea. I don't know whoever Satoshi is, he, she, or they, but I don't know whether they ever truly envisioned the idea spreading as much as it has.
I mean, they'd have to have some kind of genius gene to have perhaps forecasted that it would have taken hold this much. Or I don't know, maybe they were just such a futurist, such an accurate futurist that they did know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I haven't read the paper from cover to cover. I've seen extracts from it and pages, but it's something I'm meaning to do because I probably should try and understand it on a more technical level as well. Because there's more technical nuggets and knowledge nuggets to be found apart from what we discussed in our first podcast. But yes, I think that it was probably difficult for them to foresee the level of success and probably the time scale in which that's happened. It's been a very compressed time scale. It's only been 12 years, and it's already a $1 trillion network. And we talked about it being the fastest $1 trillion network, as in the network to which the road to $1 trillion in market capitalization was the quickest. The second being Google, and I think there's only a handful of them. So there's only $5 trillion networks out there. Another one being Microsoft, but by far the quickest to reach $1 trillion has been Bitcoin. So I think whoever Satoshi is would probably be quite proud of what it's become already, let alone what it will be in the future.
I think whoever Satoshi is, he, she, or they would have at least predicted that the standard US dollar and fiat currency system was running its course, and will eventually be unsustainable, and some other system will need to take its place.
Right. Because as we said, we discussed, every fiat currency system ever has always inflated itself out of existence.
Yeah, inflated out of its existence, or lost value over time through changing markets, extrinsic factors, and things like that. But Brother Bear, so let's talk about how Bitcoin and stores of wealth and value actually feed into the meaning of life, because everybody wants to be wealthy in some way or another. Everyone wants to be comfortable. I don't think everybody sets out to be rich or richer than everyone else. I don't think too many people go out of their way to think to try and achieve billionaireship. But how would you say that the Bitcoin revolution feeds into the meaning of life?
It's a great question, Brother Bear. I suppose one of the great struggles of man over the centuries and millennia has always been the preservation of wealth over longer periods of time. Now, that period of time being your lifetime personally in the immediate sense, and then preserving a level of wealth for future generations, your biological legacy, your offspring. So I think there's that, and I think Bitcoin is by far and away the best way to do that at the minute. It's, like I said, digital gold, and I believe it's almost taken a special place within the digital ecosystem and almost the tokenomics of the future as this store of value. That's why we call it digital gold, because it's of finite supply and all the other attributes it has, which make it so similar to gold, yet a better version in terms of the ability to divide, to exchange, to being non-fungible. Therefore it cannot be screwed with or hacked or sort of miscommunicated. Everyone knows who's got what Bitcoin and which wallets it lies. So I think for all of those reasons and many more, it's the best form of preserving wealth over time. And I think that's a big part of life in terms of ensuring, I suppose, a somewhat stable and hopefully increasing quality of life for you and then your offspring.
I think the key word there is stable, because it's one of those assets that, well, okay, this is going to sound strange because it's incredibly volatile, but in terms of the long-term sustainability, I would argue that Bitcoin has less volatility and more control in the public hands, because of its protection from central banking. And
Yeah,
that stability. You'd want to hopefully bring that down to your biological legacy, if you will.
yeah, absolutely. And stability is not something you'd associate with sort of the wild price swings that have been associated with Bitcoin. But
No.
what we've got to understand as well is that Bitcoin is still a relatively young asset. It's only 12 years old. It's a baby in the grand scheme of things. And so in this phase that we're still in, which I'd describe as sort of price discovery, we haven't really it's not a mature market. And so as we're filling this container of market cap and it's being fully adopted globally, then I think we're still going to see wild price swings. But I think what a lot of people describe as crashing upwards. So although we see massive price swings of minus 20%, maybe over 3 days, it's going to over time increase. And so if you look at the average over the last 12 years, on average year on year, if you just divide the increase over the last 12 years, on average it's been well over 200% per year, every year.
There's some incredible swings in value there.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. But like I said, the trend, the overriding trend is up and at a rate of 200% a year, which is phenomenal.
Absolutely astronomical. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I talk more and more about this with colleagues and friends around me, and there's still so much skepticism, Brother Bear. And
that's so good. I'm so happy. I really am, Brother Bear, because that means we're early, and that's the point at which there's most opportunity, because it means we're still in the early innings, which is great.
Yes, yeah, the early innings, yeah. Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I'm sure that will dissipate as more institutional investors get involved, but
yeah,
I think people are going to find it really hard to relinquish fiat currency. It's not going to happen overnight.
No, people are not going to find it easy to relinquish fiat currency. No one more so than the state and central banks, but central banks have a monopoly on the native currency, on their native fiat currency, and relinquishing that is not something they're going to do without going down a fight. They're not going to give that up or go down with fiat currency without a strong fight, and that is probably the biggest risk to the Bitcoin price in the short term, and is almost an inevitable hit on the Bitcoin price in the short term in terms of banks coming down hard on Bitcoin. Like we said, it's pretty unbannable because it doesn't pertain or sit within any given constituency, country, nation, nothing. It doesn't know borders. So in that respect, it's unbannable, but it will still inevitably scare people off Bitcoin and get them selling Bitcoin and impact the price. But in the long term, I'm not sure it matters what central banks try and do. I think Bitcoin is somewhat inevitable. Now, whether it's inevitable as a means of exchange, probably not. Or, maybe one day when we increase the block size and it's more efficient and can process that many more transactions. For now, and I think for the future, it's good enough as a store of value and pretty inefficient in terms of transactions. So you can't transact that often or that frequently as you'd like with cash, and it's more of a gold which you tend to buy and hold.
Yes, store of wealth.
Buy and hold, boys. Buy and hold.
Buy and hold. Do you see the transaction popularity coming in over the next few years, or do you think that's going to be a much longer marathon?
I think it's something for the longer term. So we're talking decades in terms of time span, rather opposed to the coming years and months. I think for now it's got a lot of work to do still as a store of value in terms of adoption. So let's keep cranking away at that. It's done a very good job of that so far. Yeah. I think it's going to be a while before we see it as an efficient means of exchange in terms of buying your coffee. No one's going to be buying coffee because the transaction fee probably exceeds by many times more than the cost of the coffee. So the exchange, so it doesn't make any sense in that sense. So I think eventually it might get there, and it's conceivable that it will become a cash once they increase the amount of transactions permissible per block. So it's conceivable that we'll get there in the not too distant future. I'm talking decades, but yeah, it's possible.
Possible in our lifetime. Yeah.
But then there's other blockchains, other cryptocurrencies that are just trying to do that. They're just trying to become the cash of the world. Ethereum isn't one of them. Ethereum's kind of trying to be more the network than anything else. Ethereum's trying to be almost the internet of cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
So if we see Bitcoin as digital gold, you can look at Ethereum as digital electricity or digital oil. It's basically what runs the network. Its token, its native token, Ether, is what's burnt essentially to run the network, or consumed and burnt to run the network.
None have come close though to the use of Bitcoin and the popularity of it, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean that they're all fundamentally looking, well, given the amount of them, there's obviously a good degree of overlap in terms of use case or intended use case. But the ones I really understand are Bitcoin. I'm getting my head around Ether. It's slightly more complex. So if you thought Bitcoin was hard, just wait till you try and get your head around Ether.
And that's different to Ethereum, right?
No, so Ether is the native token of the Ethereum blockchain.
Okay.
So it's one and the same.
One and the same.
It's the token that the Ethereum blockchain uses is just Ether, but it's an interesting one. And what's interesting about Ether is, yes, you can imagine it almost as the internet, the literal internet, but the internet of a decentralized internet, if you like, on top of which, or tokens, other tokens, many thousands of tokens utilize that network, that decentralized network that is Ethereum, to build their own tokens. They build their own tokens on top of that network, like websites build in the internet, or websites and applications utilize the internet. So, but by buying an Ether, you're not so much buying a website on an internet. I'm trying to give analogies here to what we know and understand. It's you're buying a piece of the internet, if you can try and get your head around that. And that's huge. So it's not buying a share of Amazon stock as a website. It's actually buying a piece of the internet.
Like digital real estate, kind of.
The digital real estate of the internet network. And you can become a participant in that network by having a threshold level or a number of Ether, which permits you to essentially be a validator in that network as to whether a transaction is true or not. And I believe if you own 32 Ether or more, you're able to essentially get interest on by staking your Ether. So by locking it into the network and not taking it out, by committing to not take it out for a year or two, you get compensated via interest. But it's a very complex thing, and I can go into that another time. But I think for the meaning of life, Bitcoin is an interesting form of wealth, probably a very smart way of wealth preservation for the coming decades and centuries. And I think your great grandchildren will think you're will be very grateful for you getting some.
Yeah, if they can look back and see, did grandpa or did great grandpa make the right financial decision when the fiat currency was dying on its arse, then I suppose that that'll be seen in a very positive light. But yeah, I suppose the come back to the meaning of life question, and again, this is with the meaning of life, I feel like the question is actually usually more interesting than the answer. It's one of those things that you ponder and postulate on, but on a financial sense, and in terms of having control over your own wealth and ultimately your own future, Bitcoin I think feeds into that quite nicely, as we're seeing steady decline of incomes and steady decline in normal folks being able to live comfortably. Yeah,
absolutely. And do you have a sort of a different definition, or your own personal feelings of what your meaning is in life, or is it something kind of you look towards or are refining over time? How do you see it?
I think it's something I've got dozens of different answers to, depending on the day and depending on my mood.
Yeah,
it's so easy to try and pigeonhole, and I would try to do that to sound smart or more certain of my future, but ultimately it depends on the mood I'm in and depends on the year as well. And that's why I think Alan Watts's definition is so beautifully self-contained. Just the meaning of life is to just be alive. I think that's a very simple way of putting it. It doesn't require too much overthinking, exhaustion, and there's less margin for error there. I think just being kind to others as well is another big part of that, and that's such another trite point. But I think it should be central to understanding your personal meaning of life.
Yeah, I think it's such a simple message, right? Because, like we said, people can search long and hard for the meaning, and yet it might be staring them in the face in front of them. So, and I think so much of that is true. There's so much beauty in the world. Like we said, someone can spend a lifetime studying a blade of grass and not be done by the end of their life, but there's so much complexity and intrigue, and I think if you have an intrigued mind, a mind that sort of has an insatiable quench for knowledge and learning, then there's kind of challenges that just pop up in front of you that keep you so engaged. Maybe the meaning of life is somewhat answered just through the fact that you're so engaged and with the world and interfacing correctly with the world, that it's not really something that's looked at in horror, but more just maybe lived.
Yep. There's so much complexity and so many variables to any outcome. One example, one of my close friends, he wanted to be a firefighter, and that almost became his life's meaning and life's goal. And he spent years and years trying to get into the academy, and then he finally did get into the academy, and he went through all the hoops, jumped through those hoops to finally become a fully fledged firefighter. And then he realized that he didn't enjoy the work that much, and he didn't really get on with his colleagues very well, and he started to have identity issues. And again, those are all the variables that we don't even consider, and sometimes that's why you just have to really enjoy the moment as best you can. As as kind of cliched as that sounds, and it is a cliche, you may get to that goal, whether it's to be a investment banker or great basketball player or whoever you want to be, and realize that actually none of those things really did make you happy. It's the relationships that did.
I think it's so. Yeah, exactly. I think it's the experiences on the way that will kind of more the life and where life is found, as opposed to the destination. And cheesy as that sounds, it's the journey, not the destination. I think that's very often true. You even hear about musicians, wanting to be this or that, and then hitting that Everest, arriving, and only being disappointed. And almost hitting a deep, dark depression in the time in which you'd imagine they'd be sort of, in some state of euphoria. It's almost by achieving their Everest, they've almost met their hero and been disappointed. And yet the true joy, unexpectedly and inadvertently, has actually been on the path to getting there, as opposed to getting there.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of philosophical arguments come back to suffering as essential to the meaning of life. And this is actually there's actually some conservative political arguments in here as well, that to have a fulfilling life, to have a life that is in the end happy, and in the moment happy, you shouldn't pursue a life that's purely easy at all times. You should be trying to break a mental and physical sweat every single day. It should be stressful, and of course that begs the question: is suffering in some form necessary for a happy life?
Yes, absolutely. I think in a large sense and in a big way, suffering is almost necessary to feel pleasure. In the end, it's almost the yin and the yang, right? You've got to feel the yang to feel the yin and all that. So every antithesis needs itself to exist.
Yes. Yeah, the yin yang philosophy is a great way of encapsulating that. I think that a bit of suffering, even if it's financial, makes things better in the long run, as long as you're able to pull yourself out of that. Self-determination as well, and this comes back to Bitcoin too. I think with the way that the monetary system and even the political system has been developing over the past 2 decades, people have felt a void where self-determination should lie. And some of these new hacks, these new technologies, I think, have been absolutely fantastic in restoring some of that self-determination for some of the forgotten people in society.
Yeah. Yeah, fully agree.
I mean, Bitcoin itself is, that it started off with a lot of, I suppose, outcasts and unusual people getting involved in it. And I suppose they're the ones laughing the most now.
Yes. No, it is very true. It's often the contrarians that are the torchbearers, at least at the beginning. The internet, there's an infinite number of examples you can point to, where it's often the crazies that that's what Steve Jobs called them, right? Here's to the crazies, here's to the mad ones, the torchbearers of any revolutionary idea. I think Einstein said that if an idea is not at first absurd, then there's no hope for it. And I think there's something like deep truth to that, like
some huge truth.
Yeah, well,
to
I
that.
think there's a deep truth to that, because there's like you hear. I was listening to this other podcast about this angel investor and many others who, it's almost like they almost guide themselves according to the craziest idea. Something like Robinhood. Millennials no commissions app for trading. Millennials who have been through a hard recession from 2008 2009, disenfranchised with the stock market, having huge losses and not experiencing anything good. And people, kids, that stereotype, living with their parents, living in the basement, not having much disposable income. How the hell are you going to make money off them as traders? And yet if you introduce something that's zero commission and democratize finance and make the stock market as accessible as Robinhood has, funnily enough, it actually works very well.
There was a huge gap in the market.
There was
huge demand for that.
But it wasn't obvious that there was. Like, it almost took a madman to do that, because yes, it's obvious there was a gap in the market, with the benefit of hindsight. But back in the day when I think it was created, back in 2016, 17, it wasn't so obvious at all.
No, but I think it usually is. The sort of two tropes you see with very successful entrepreneurs. One is a brilliant ability to forecast and see where a demand will be in, say, 5 or 10 years down the road. We saw this with something like Uber or Airbnb. But then the other aspect is that absurdism and that ability to actually disconnect from reality and the day-to-day drudgery. Because those individuals that just stick to that 9-to-5 drudgery and think very little out of that box, they seldom make the millions, and they seldom come up with the new crazy ideas, right? You need a madman or a mad woman to create this kind of positive outcome.
Yeah, you almost need someone who can rip themselves from the status quo, and really just cut that umbilical cord and just start thinking completely out of the box. That's why we call it out of the box, right? Because they've managed to pop out of the box and just think about the realms as they are, as opposed to how they've been presented through a lens.
Yes.
So it's hard. It's very hard, because everything's presented to you through a lens of one sort or another, and it's hard sort of to divorce you from all of that and look at things from first principles as they are. But something I just wanted to touch on, we were talking sort of about you don't have a low without a high, you don't have sadness without happiness.
Yeah.
There's a song by the renowned DJ Kygo titled Let Her Go. I just wanted to read you a few lines from that, because I remember listening to that, and there's certain lyrics they just gloss over, they sound good, and then as you start listening to them and they have some deep meaning. So
yeah,
I'll just read you a few lines here. Well, you only need light when it's burning low, only miss the sun when it starts to snow, only know you love her when you let her go, only know you've been high when you're feeling low, only hate the road when you're missing home, only know your love when you let her go.
That's actually got quite some quite deep meaning there. I haven't heard the song itself, but I think that talks very much to the yin and the yang, and the, the enjoyment of the low when you're in the high, or the, you know what I'm saying, like kind of the extremes there. I suppose you miss beautiful weather when it's cold, and when it's beautiful weather you don't really think about the cold too much, but I suppose there's some good meaning behind that. And who is that? Kygo, did you say, Brother Bear?
Yes, Kygo. It's something I've called. I believe it's sort of like EDM house music, but it's sort of more specifically something I like to term tropical house. So it's quite good. I'm sure you've heard it before. It's just obviously reading it out, you can actually pick out the meaning in the words.
Yeah, and again, this comes back to kind of the rags to riches scenario, right? Like if you've experienced riches all your life, you never really feel the true happiness that someone who started off, as a homeless person, or at least someone very poor, who was able to excel to become very well off, even if it wasn't to a millionaire status. There's a huge amount of happiness there.
Yeah, maybe it is a yin and yang kind of correcting, because I think a yin and yang are almost there to keep each other in check, right? So if the yin is to bring up the businessman from a very poor, impoverished background to billionaire status, and then his son is almost there to rebalance that and almost destroy it and burn it back. It's almost like he's the corrector. He's going to do everything to destroy that wealth and be a bad custodian of that wealth.
Well, it's that famous saying, show me a great man who is the son of a great man.
Yes, that's so true. Yeah, there are exceptions to that, but yeah, by as a rule of thumb, you're right. It's very true.
Definitely, there would be exceptions. I'm sure. It's just, I think that the trailblazer will have less likely to have some certain mental health issues, or self-conscious issues. Perhaps the receiver of the wealth, just by being born, will have. It's often the most oppressed ones are the ones that have just been given everything in any outcome in society, whether it's by parents or by the government. These kind of situations often don't lead to very, very happy lives, which is funny. I think that opens up the door to so many different discussions of the human condition, Brother Bear.
I think being gifted wealth like that is dangerous, because it opens the door and starts to entertain ideas of anarchy. If you're given everything on a silver platter, then you kind of don't have the necessary struggle to shape yourself. And so not having that resistance, although on paper sounds great, is actually one of the most destructive things you can do to someone. Not giving them resistance to push against and create their own persona.
Yes. It's that resistance, isn't it? It's that struggle.
I think resistance and struggle is necessary to creating anything resembling personality and perseverance, and what's that word? Tenacity.
It's a character building exercise to have some suffering, and this is one thing that always struck me in the US, because of at least on the surface level, the amount of character and happiness in people's daily interactions. And I was always scratching my head and confused that people had that much character and happiness when they didn't have healthcare given to them, or they had to cover their own healthcare. Though this isn't a rule of thumb, and it wouldn't be fair for me to say this is for everyone, but I think there's certainly happiness that has come out of that struggle for some people in the States and probably other countries.
Yeah.
There's certainly some negatives that come out to just a baseline amount of happiness and things not happiness, but a baseline amount of gifted wealth.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that's it should what should be given by the state, like we've talked about in the past. Is I think we're sort of broadly aligned with this, that the state should only provide the very bare minimums and the bare necessities of life, right? One of those being healthcare, I believe, and then that at least alleviates that one burden of health, because to be healthy is everything. Without that, you kind of not able to build anything at all of your own life. So I think that's almost a baseline thing, and then after that, there's obviously education as well. Would be nice.
Education, good. And Brother Bear, tell me about some of your observations when you were in Japan, again, because you noticed there was such a different mentality and approach to life that you'd seen in the West. And although these things are incredibly difficult to gauge, were some of your impressions that it was a happier place, a sadder place, or too tough to call?
I think the place wasn't it wasn't clearly one thing or the other, because I think the Japanese people are often quite insular and maybe don't wear their heart on their sleeve as much. So emotions are happy and sad are sometimes repressed, although I certainly saw maybe the happiness being quite a bit more obvious than I would expect, than I was kind of all led to believe beforehand. So they are happy people from my perspective ultimately. It's just that maybe they don't show it as often or clearly as we might perceive someone super extroverted as a culture such as the United States or Canada. And so, yeah, I mean, it was an amazing place, and in the sense that the attention to detail impressed me, and it's almost an ingrained psyche, an ingrained culture of just attention to detail and a pride in your own work, a pride in your environment, whether that's urban or your domestic environment, but just being proud, and very meticulous, and an attention to detail, and it's just everything's so clean. There is such a level of attention to detail. It's like a perfect Playmobil universe. Everything's just so perfectly ticking over and maintained, and it's just so impressive. I don't know how they're not the richest country in the world in some ways.
I think discipline, that's a good point. I mean, I think discipline is probably such a big part of that. I know you mentioned there was a very noticeable degree of discipline amongst the population there when it came to work and life even. And I do believe in terms of human happiness and finding your own personal meaning of life, I think discipline really helps people on the way to finding peace. As weird as that sound, because it pushes you to do things you don't want to do. It pushes you to work out, or it basically pushes you into areas that you're not that comfortable in. But I do believe it holds a key to peace.
Yeah, it was almost a sense that there was a pleasure and prize to order in Japan, and I wonder, if they are faced with chaos, whether that's a physical or a mental challenge that's somewhat chaotic, how good they are at turning that into order. I don't know. Or are they actually not very good at doing that, and that's why they try and institute order wherever they can. And so when chaos does rear its head, inevitably sooner or later, they struggle where there's ambiguity. So they like rules, they like black and white, but where there's a grey area, maybe that's not turned into something productive quickly enough. I'm not sure. I'm sure there's many deep reasons, but it's a very, very fascinating culture. And I think not necessarily maybe the most inventive, because, or at least not the most inventive in more recent decades, in terms of, all of the big technology firms have come out of the United States, and I think that's maybe because Japan is such an orderly way of thinking, and maybe that's why you see so much great engineering come out of Japan. Sony, Panasonic, Toyota, Honda, all of these things are extremely ordered. Engineering itself is a very orderly first principles based
Yeah.
discipline, and then something kind of blue sky thinking required for something like Airbnb or Facebook or Uber is just not part of their culture as much as mechanics and logic are.
Yes. A sort of a well regimented dedication to rules and principles. That's where their
Right.
strengths lie.
Right. But blue
And
sky
that's
thinking innovation is
mm,
and sort of abstract conceptualization doesn't come naturally to them maybe.
yeah.
But this is in broad brushstrokes. You say that I'll caveat all of this with that.
Yes, of course, because we're talking quite general terms here. But that's definitely a good observation. I think the Americans, they revel in a level of ambiguity that opens the door for blue sky thinking,
Yeah.
and creating what you would see as absurdist outcomes,
Mm.
turning that into an amazing product or an amazing innovation. Definitely, though, on the Japanese side, in addition to the discipline nature, they do seem to have such a communitarian level of discipline. One example that really resonated with me, Brother Bear, was after the Fukushima disaster, and there was there were scores of 80-year-olds helping out near the blast zone. Because they had the attitude of, well, it doesn't matter if I get cancer in, 10, 20 years, I'll be, 90, 100, probably not even alive by then. I'm thinking more of those younger than me. And I just can't imagine that kind of scenario happening in the West, where the elderly go out to help in a disaster like that and have that kind of, I don't know, beyond individualistic way of thinking.
Well, that's an incredible example, right? I didn't know that was the case, actually. Where did you hear about that? That's fascinating.
Yeah, I actually heard it from an engineer I work with who'd done some work in Japan, and was actually present at the time of the disaster,
Gosh.
in Japan, and he said, he thought, "Oh, this would never happen in Canada or the US,
Mm.
you protect the old stay in, but no, the old were all going out volunteering because they knew if it went south and they got cancer in 10, 20 years, that wouldn't really matter to them. So it's kind of, I suppose it's not that it wouldn't matter, but they were putting the lower generations first, sort of an extension of the seven tree theory. So, oh,
That's amazing.
these amazing examples of how different things are there and how people see happiness and treat human life.
Yeah, I mean that's an amazing display of altruism, right?
Mm.
I mean, I've never, like you said, it's the ultimate sacrifice because you're putting your health on the line. And I imagine the reason is, like you say, is for the sake of future generations,
Mm.
which is an amazing long-term way of thinking. And I just wish more people thought that way in the day-to-day, not necessarily in the context of a disaster, but to think a few generations ahead and not just about the span of your own lifetime, which is actually pretty short-sighted if you really think about it. And we talked about, cosmic timescales, laughing at our lifespans. Like I said, we're just a spark, we're just a blip. So we maybe do need to start thinking more on the timescale of millennia as opposed to lifetime, because that will lead to a sustainable world. And that imperative has never been more true than now, particularly when we're starting to face climate crises, and these temperature increases are beginning to actually manifest in front of our very eyes.
Yes, absolutely. And I know you've been reminding me a lot, Andre, that Elon Musk and Tesla and, well, all of his adventures are very much mission driven over profit driven.
Yeah.
And that is quite evident. So I think that's just a prime example of someone in our time that's at least looking beyond their own generation. And again, okay, maybe there's selfishness there with leaving a legacy. I'm sure there is, but at the end of the day, it's long-term thinking that's going to create a happier and peaceful human world.
Yeah, exactly. I think Elon Musk is a great example of that, because he's looking to extend the consciousness and understanding of the universe, the human consciousness, in terms of what we conceive as the boundaries of our own being, and also our capabilities. So Tesla, he said, and I do believe it when he says this, that he's not in it for the money at all. It's more just increasing or accelerating the advent of electric vehicles as the global norm, and I think he's done a great job in doing that already. And then there's the other bit of extending the consciousness and reach of humanity beyond just Earth to Mars and other planets. When we start conceiving of ourselves as more than mere Earthlings, and sort of as a species over multiple planets and then amongst the stars, I think that's a very inspiring future, and sort of a future worth getting up for.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. An outcome that is so much farther beyond just our own lifespan. And the SpaceX missions, these are very bold aspirations, but we need to be bold and we need to be absurdist to progress forward. I think that the NASA and the space race, unfortunately the incentives were not great in why we were doing that, but at least we saw within the span of a decade with technology, you look back now, we achieved getting to the moon. And I don't know, I think that a lot of, coming back to again the meaning of life, excelling beyond ourselves as well, pulling all our weight together, and all of our acumen and prowess as humans, as a collective, as kind of a hive mind almost, and driving technological change through that.
Yeah, I think you're going to see sort of exponential development and growth in technology through the advent of something that really integrates us as a species into us, something you just described as a hive mind, where we're all thinking as one. And what that means is you bring what would have been available to us on a linear time scale 200 years from now, we can bring that into being, to happening within 10, 20 years from now, because we're all thinking as one and pooling our resources together. And I think, to a large extent, the reason we've seen the technological, sort of the mind-boggling technological acceleration over the last 100 years has been the advent of telecommunications and ever more efficient telecommunications, to the point of where we can just hit a button and I'm talking to you in Canada and you can hear me instantly with little to no delay. That is a non-trivial innovation that's really accelerated innovations, period. And then the internet probably being the very latest instantiation of that, which we're utilizing to talk now. And then, it just means that scientific papers of one sort or another, whether that's speaking to a particular technology or an idea, is more freely available and more quickly freely available to iterate amongst scientists and the community and the world at large. I'm just taking papers as an example here of information, the exchange of information, but it could be many mediums, right? But they're all ultimately relying on the internet for a fast back and forth, a ping-ponging of ideas, and therefore arriving at ideas that no one person could ever arrive at, but sort of through the combination and iteration between multiple parties, you kind of arrive at supreme innovations.
It's an incredibly layered amount of innovation that's led us to this point, through different people and businesses and organizations. The internet is a brilliant contemporary example, because it's been the foundation, it's been the scaffolding for so many other innovations. What became like a small peer-to-peer rental market blew up into Airbnb. What became a small network for I don't know if it was at Yale or Harvard, a small elite group there, blew up into Facebook. These innovations we've seen in our lifetime, they all rely on that foundation of the internet, and soon we're going to be seeing the currency to follow that.
Yeah, and I suppose to some extent you could argue these latest technologies like Airbnb, Facebook, increasingly maybe not, they're not decentralized because they still have central nodes in terms of the governance of those platforms and operations of those platforms and updates on those platforms, but there is a sense of the nodes apart from the central node are pretty global, and they don't really care about national borders as much. You know, look at Airbnb, look at Uber. It's not particularly national.
No.
Whereas
nothing.
something like hard engineering as a business actually does involve a factory, and it's kind of not as readily decentralized as something like a network, an internet network. And that's what the internet's enabled, right? And so this is what we were saying around. It's strange that we don't already have a currency that maybe is as or more decentralized than these internet companies.
The key lies with the software, right? That's the most footloose, or the software innovation and companies has kind of put national borders and boundaries into shame, and made them appear kind of outdated. And then what comes with that is national currencies.
Yes.
You know, whether or not they were grossly overinflated. You know, I think digital currency would have taken off anyway, because of an ease of transaction,
right,
overcoming national boundaries and things like that. So again, these are more innovations that give people more options and outcomes to enjoy the full spectrum of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's all driven and powered by the internet to more or lesser extent. And what Elon's doing, a lesser known project, is the Starlink project, which is essentially the envisioning of a global internet wherever you are. So it's not like you're tied to a provider and the fiber optics to your house. It's literally beamed from a satellite, a constellation of satellites that surround the Earth. Is almost a shell, a sphere of a swarm of satellites that will provide this internet, and at a very high speed anywhere on the planet ultimately. And so when you combine that sort of technology with something like a Neuralink, where we're all talking to each other subconsciously, maybe not subconsciously, but consciously, we'd like probably better.
Hopefully consciously.
Yeah, I don't want all of my ideas being freely available and open source, but it's very interesting what sort of the marriage of those two technologies could yield, right? Something like a global internet, we're all connected to it in our minds. I mean, just imagine the pace at which you could develop personally as well. Not to speak of the collective innovations we could come up with once we're all connected in more truly, right? Because at the minute we're mediating through hardware that's not really integrated in our bodies in any way.
So we're still atomized in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. And when that integration does happen, I think it's only a matter of time before it does. I don't necessarily think it needs to be dystopian, actually.
No, I mean, the mind does dart to dystopian outcomes. Minority Report kind of, outcomes of control and surveillance. The issue is it could be misused, right? There's nothing intrinsically good or bad about technological advancement. It's how it's used, right, by humans. And I think in some aspects we've seen a bit of a decline in human social skills through social media, in sort of the day-to-day. And the I think that's sadly driven away from living life just as life is, and trying to observe it, but through a secondary eye, really. But on the other hand, all these evolutions drive technological advancement through idea sharing. As you said earlier, what could only be achievable in a few hundred years suddenly gets fast-tracked to 5 or 6 years because of that collective understanding and that collective access to information. So it does not have to be dystopian at all, right? It's how conscious are we as humans for each other and our own well-being when the technology arrives at our doorstep. That's what's going to be the determining factor.
Yeah, exactly. And all the censorship that goes with it to make sure, because if I permit you to sort of have untapped access to my thoughts on a particular topic, then great, because what that means is I'm able to understand a very complex idea that you've perfectly encapsulated and articulated in your mind, but maybe for whatever reason aren't able to express in words. But you almost telepathically through the hardware integrated in your brain, you're almost able just to tell me in a microsecond what you mean, and I get it. And so I think that manner of telepathy enabled by integrated hardware will be possible in the future, and I think it sort of will accelerate innovations inevitably.
Yeah, because it will ideally remove context and certain personal barriers and biases. If you're able to telepathically convey a concept that makes perfect sense to me in my interpretation through the hardware that I have, I think that's going to be able to, I suppose, transport ideas, removing the human bias, which, let's face it, has been the biggest, barrier to development since the year dot.
Yeah, so I wonder, Leo, whether we're in kind of the dark ages of social media, right? And in the sense that we've got our social media today and now is inorganic, so it's not very human at all, because it's fundamentally disconnected from our biology. But when it does get integrated into us, it's not so much screens and pictures, it's interaction of a more organic nature, that sort of cross-pollinated between people and their networks. So it's not a screen, and it's not using almost atomized technology that sits outside of the body, but it's almost it becomes more personable. So I wonder whether we're just going through a teething problem at the minute as to how social media materializes.
I think that's an astute observation, because were we really in our current state ever ready for social media to the point at which it's blown up now? I mean, you look at how it manifests through apps like TikTok, Instagram, and kind of the level of short attention spans that are required to enjoy those applications. Maybe we truly are in a dark age, and actually this is kind of the kind of uncertain transitionary period into it being utilized to its full strength and to actually deliver human happiness. I would argue right now social media in general doesn't deliver too much happiness to the people I know that use it most. I'm sure there's some happiness delivered, and who am I to say that it's completely bad? I don't think it is completely bad, but I would say the teething period or the growing pain period is a perfect way to encapsulate it.
Yeah, the minute in a lot of ways it's too maybe open in some ways. In some ways it's quite unsocial on social media, but I think a true social media would be something which requires maybe presence of mind, and I mean that in almost a literal sense. So the presence of mind from through a hardware that is literally connected to your mind. But yeah, I don't know how, the form in which that would take. Would you be able to share it with the minds of a number of people, and it almost arrives with pre-configured filters with the people you want to or not? I don't know. It could almost just breed a more, or could it just be the power of thought that sends something to them?
Yeah, would it be kind of instantaneous? You're able to switch it on and all of your thoughts are kind of rendered? Or I'm just trying to envision how
it's so abstract, isn't it? Yeah, it's so abstract.
It's incredibly abstract.
Like could I just think about you and say that almost in my mind without saying the words? You can obviously say things in your brain. You know what I mean by that, don't you? You just say it almost like you're reading, right?
Like you're reading, yeah. You can hear it. It's like your voice or someone's voice is saying it in your brain.
Yeah, and sending that as a voice note, for example, is a very simplest example.
Yeah, like instead of texting you on, messaging you on WhatsApp or something like that, could I think of your name, activate it, and then send the exact thought and all the feelings attached to that thought?
Yeah, the feelings are another big one, right? Because then
Mm.
that would be cool. And almost make it even less procedural. The name, their message is this. Like it's kind of, it just all
Yes.
comes as a bundle. And I was like, oh, I just got a message from Leo, and I don't even need to check my messages. I just feel the message. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's it's an interesting one. And then you know, do you have sort of personal parameters and pre-configured filters whereby obviously you don't want to be bombarded with ideas from people all over the shop when you're
No.
working, but you know, what's work? No, that might look very different in 40 years from now.
I'm sure. I'm sure work. I mean, work already looks so different now to how it did.
It does, right?
Yeah, 30, 40 years ago. But that would be such a stream of consciousness. It would almost be like a psychedelic approach to communication through
Yeah, I think that's such a good way
Silicon
of putting
Valley
it.
technology. It would be though,
Yeah.
wouldn't it? And everything would flow into each other, and I think that would be a very interesting way to communicate, at least to have that as an option.
Yeah, it'd be very cool. It'd be very cool. Because you could argue it's probably the way the ideas should be. And it's almost, you know, instead of hashing out an idea over 2-3 hours and finally understanding what the other person meant, being able to understand something instantaneously. But I don't know, ideas are so complex and so based on someone's own lived experience and context up until that point. It might be hard, and it will be hard, in fact. But no.
Will there ever be a technology that's able to actually convey someone's feeling, right? Because I know there's certain hacks where people have tried to take a crack at it. For example, you know, those meditation headbands and things like that they make noises when you're supposedly in deep meditation, and those kind of technologies. There's certain automated bots that can perceive, you know, your feelings through different vitals and certain. I don't know whether they're able to measure if it's as simple as just blood pressure, or are we talking something more deep, pheromones? But you know, whatever it is there going to be a technology that can capture that and share that with another human?
Yeah, I'm sure in the moment, but then I struggle to understand how any technology could encapsulate lived experience, at least lived experience before the device was there, because the device wouldn't know about all the lived experience and thoughts and feelings that happened beforehand. But like I said, I think we'd almost see it as a symbiotic relationship of mutual benefit between the device and the brain, in the best case, right, whereby you're helped by the device and you're able to now to do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do and think, and you wouldn't be able to understand people on the same deep level that you do now with the device. And I think once you maybe experience that, it'll be hard to go back.
Yeah. Well, it's like iPhones, isn't it? Once you get into that level of constant connectivity, it's very hard to switch back. But yeah, there would be certainly dystopian-like perceptions of that and a lot of resistance. But once it fully reached critical mass, it'd be incredibly difficult to go back. If you're able to convey your feelings to a T to someone else, that would be an incredible experience.
That would be an incredible experience, wouldn't it? It really would. And I think it would. I think in its best instantiation and version, reduce conflict.
I think that's the biggest win for the human race that would come out of that.
Yeah.
I think
Because you'd understand why people think what they think, right? A little more.
Exactly. So, which would mean even if you still fundamentally disagreed with them, you'd be able to empathize.
Yes. Exactly.
So the empathy would probably, you would hope that humans wouldn't screw it up, and hopefully it would result in less war and less polarization.
Yes. And I think ultimately it's that kind of technology that will make you realize the absurdity of the nation state.
Oh yes, absolutely. The nation state is being belittled every day through demand for constant free trade, the new digital landscape, digital currency. But yeah, absolutely, that technology will even further undermine cultural barriers and national barriers, make them worthless.
I think that really is the world, and I very much envision the world as a planet, a globe, and really looking at, like I said, the planet from the International Space Station. One does not see borders, and borders become very silly constructs from that distance. And that's probably because they are, right? Because I think you're seeing the planet for what it is at that height. And so I think the nation states world over will be repealed slowly over time. Now, I think that might be a difficult and choppy and violent process in some cases, but I think it might happen. The more I'm looking at the news and what's happening with technology, everything from cryptocurrency to neural networks to AI and neural net with these implantable devices and what that could yield, I think the more I'm starting to think that's going to come in, that timeline's going to come in, as opposed to it being 1,000 years from now, it might be a few hundred.
Technology will act as a catalyst, and I think that this is all going to come from the bottom up, Andre. I don't think it's going to come from the top down.
For the first time ever, truly, right?
Yeah, I really believe that. I mean, one of the examples comes to mind is the European Union, and that was a very top-down structure, a very quite arguably undemocratic structure that forced this like one continent outcome on every country in Europe. And I don't think there's necessarily, I think they identified the problem with the nation state when they did that, and I think that it was a noble aspiration, but because it came from the top down, it was not palatable to the public in many countries. And it tried to create this continental fiat currency, again a very top-down measure that didn't necessarily deliver in the long term. But whereas if you look at sort of more bottom-up progressions, you know, whether it's crypto, Neuralink, whether it's just people's day-to-day perceptions of, oh, this person's another nationality to me, that shouldn't matter at all. You know, that's where you're going to see the long-term civilization change.
And I think that's a future worth aspiring for, right? What do you think?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I think it's the only way things should go, really. Don't get me wrong. Like everyone identifies with a culture, and that's got to be preserved. But that shouldn't supersede global development.
Yeah.
You can keep that. You can retain your culture, protect it in your daily life. But that shouldn't supersede, you know, global one world, as soppy as that sounds. But I mean, in terms of trade, currency, the digital revolution, I would certainly be all for all those things.
I think that we all stand a lot more to gain from that world than we stand to lose. We stand to gain a lot less, I think, with staying as we are.
I think there's certain warm, fuzzy gains that will be made from keeping the nation state strong, and whether that's in people's, you know, perception of their own culture not changing, and I understand certain feelings behind that. But overall, I think those gains are dwarfed by the gains of a one world theory or a one world outcome.
Yeah, I think that would be extremely cool. I mean, you know, global mobility is already very high. You just want to sort of look at the relative benefits of having. I think gradually it will just be a token of the nation state becoming ever less relevant. I think there's so many processes and governance, everything from tax through to railways, infrastructure. Like how do you start to denationalize all this stuff into something resembling ever larger geographies, right?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of on the granular level. Those are going to be all the tricky things. You know, how do you get this country where people only have faith in their own currency or this certain industry, how do you kind of globalize that?
Yeah, but when driving across Europe, actually, you can start to envision it quite quickly, right? Because it's not so much fine. We may keep the borders for another 2,000 years, but they'll just be such a irrelevance.
Well, no, you've made a brilliant point there. The borders will soon become like county borders, you know, which
Like
they
Europe
have.
in a way, right? Because you can drive from east to west across Europe and sometimes not notice you've crossed the country, seriously.
Oh yeah, I mean, I remember driving through France, the Netherlands, Germany, and going into each of those countries was respectively, it was like going into another county, you know.
Yeah, and maybe that's good enough for now. Maybe it is. But I'm sure there's levels to this that we're not even able to fathom at this point that need to be almost repealed and globalized.
Yeah, I'm sure there's more tangible things. Well, that is a very tangible thing, but in terms of currency, I think in terms of how certain industries are governed and how government gets involved in them, cronyism. The dangerous thing I think throughout history has been when the nation state and the government, or rather the nationhood and the government are intertwined, and that's sort of where you get kind of more fascist ideologies and protectionism and autarky and all the ideas that basically are the exact opposite to what we're saying.
Yeah,
you can still have a strong sense of patriotism, but that's very much distance from the government, and I think that's probably more desirable because once
definitely.
the government, yeah.
And I wonder whether the geography of how we see other nations today, or even other continents today, might be a more apt example. Will be mapped onto the planetary level, right? So we will look at the people of Mars as almost we look at people from a different country today.
That'd be a brilliant outcome.
Yeah, it'd be so cool, right? But ultimately, it's I think the tribalism we all have innate in our biology and DNA, just writ large, and I suppose extrapolated another level up. Once we're all one planet, then how do we go beyond that, or how do we extrapolate the idea of tribalism beyond that? Well, it's planet versus planet, and then maybe it's solar system versus solar system, and you carry on, right? And then galaxy versus galaxy. But yeah, that's it's a pretty heady thought.
Yeah, that's when you get into kind of the intergalactic level of thinking. Intergalactic. But I think these are all interesting future outcomes to ponder, because human happiness needs to be at the forefront of any development and change. If you're changing a currency system or the way we treat the nation state, obviously let's hope that it's for the good of the planet. But these changes are, I think, whether people like it or not, they're happening. The drive away from the nation state is inevitable. So it's how we manage that. There's basically how we manage opportunity and how we ensure that happens in a equal and a positive way, really.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Brother Bear.
Brother Bear, on the intergalactic note, I think we can wrap this one up.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed this one, Brother Bear. It was a nice rambler, but I think we touched on some good points.
Yes, a rambling meander of different ideas dedicated to human happiness and peace.
Beautiful. And on that note,
farewell. Ta-ta. Goodbye.
Ta-ta and farewell.
Pow! Pow!